So welcome everybody. Today's session is about what is the difference between ACT, SAT, PSAT. Trust me, even I don't know very well. And I asked Mike here. Mike is the testing guru. He's the guru of all gurus. So he's going to help us out today. So here is what we're going to discuss. We're going to meet our team. I'm part of the Gifted Gabber. Then I'm going to introduce Mike, and Mike is going to give his wonderful presentation. And please type away any questions you have. Every question will be addressed. And we'll have a good Q&A session. And don't think about writing any notes because I'm recording everything and I'll put it in my YouTube. Okay. So this is our team. It's me, Joe. I have Ann Shields, who's a career coach, and I have my educational consultant / son, Ninad. And the services that we offer are college counseling and planning. Then Anne is a Myers-Briggs certified career coach. We give career coaching. I do academics coaching as well, study skills coaching, executive functioning coaching, and I teach communication skills. Okay, and here we have Mike, who is our testing guru. He has 26 years of experience, intensive experience in all things testing. And trust me, I was on his podcast and he's extremely passionate about testing. He runs his institute called Chariot Institute, which he started in 2009. He's in Rochester, New York. He's also a trainer, a certified ACT trainer. So we are in excellent hands. Sit back, grab some popcorn, and let's listen to what Mike has to say. Okay, so Mike, I'm going to stop sharing. You can go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jill. I'm really thrilled to be speaking with everybody today. I appreciate the gracious invitation, and I really liked your slide, Joe. Slide decks look good. So I'm here to talk to everybody about what the SAT and ACT and PSAT are, why they matter, and what you can do about them. And as Joe says, we're going to answer all your questions. Every question that you possibly have about the tests, why they matter, how colleges look at them. If I can't answer that question, I know someone who can, and I can find an answer for you within 24 hours. So when I talk about the SAT and ACT, I like to use the image of the Rock'em Sock'em robots. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the old, this was a toy when I was a kid. This was very low tech. And the teens in the room sometimes don't recognize them. The adults often do. And what I love about the Rock'em Sock'em robots is they really symbolize the way College Board, which creates the SAT, and AT, creates the imaginatively named ACT, have been duking it out in the public sphere for decades to win the hearts and minds of colleges and test takers. And because of the way they've been battling and the way that they change over time, each of them influences the other. So when the SAT changes, it might copy a little of the ACT. And we saw this in the last revision in 2015. When the ACT changes, it might emulate the SAT. When the tests change, the state of American education changes in response. And when colleges change what they want, then that ripples through the system, which is to say that those of you who are familiar with the SAT and ACT because you've taken it before, or one of your older children took it before, I urge you to look at it through new eyes because the tests change a little bit every year. And this has been one of the most dynamic periods of testing and admissions since in the modern age. It's been a crazy year. I don't need to tell anybody. And that means a lot has changed with the tests. So who am I? Joe shared some great information about me, and I want to share briefly why I've come to be burdened with so much knowledge about the SAT and ACT. I am the president of Chariot Learning. I'm a New York City native, but I moved to Rochester 13 years ago, and not long after I started Chariot Learning. We specialize in SAT and ACT tutoring and classes, academic coaching, subject tutoring. We run proctored practice tests all year long. Right now they're online, and people are welcome to join from wherever they are. Before that, I was the director of exam prep for Huntington Learning Center, and I was right there in the corporate office with the Huntingtons, creating all of the national franchises, SAT and ACT programs, among other things. And before that, I was with Kaplan. I am also the co-host of the Test and the Rest podcast. This is the podcast about testing, admissions, and learning. It is for parents and educators. And we've had very distinguished guests over, at this point, 173 episodes, including Jo Cathar. She was fantastic. I'm also the president of the National Test Prep Association, and this is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to standards and advocating for the responsible administration and use of standardized tests for admissions and assessment. I am a certified trainer for ACT, so I train teachers across the country in different school districts. I am the founder of the Test Prep Tribe, which is an industry group. Basically, I am tapped into a national network of educators, of professionals who look at the SAT and ACT and every aspect of this closely. And I get to drink from a fire hose of knowledge on a daily basis. And I'm here to share that with you. So let me make this as easy to understand as possible. You're not going to be taking any tests tonight, okay? So put your calculators away. We're just going to talk about the tests. We're not going to take any. Let's just start with what the tests are. And basically, what is the same that what you think about it is true, and then what's maybe changed? Okay, so one thing that you need to know about the SAT and ACT, we'll just put this in context. I'm not talking about the PSAT yet. I'm talking about the SAT and ACT. They are both standardized college entrance exams. They're administered all year long, and we'll talk about the timeline. They test substantially the same skills and content. The SAT and ACT have never been as similar as they are right now. That's not to say they're exactly the same, and that students can score better on one or the other, but many students do roughly the same in both. As we talk about the exam, you'll start to understand some of the subtle differences between the two. And you might be thinking in your head, oh, that sounds like my son, or that sounds like the test for my daughter. But I will share two different ways to figure out which test is better for a teen. I'll share the easy way. I will share the accurate way. But at the end of the day, both tests are equally accepted by all schools and programs. I do not know a single program or school in 2020 that preferred one over the other, which means once you find the test that's right, you can take that to the school of your dreams, the scholarship of your dreams, the program of your dreams. Now, both the SAT and ACT test reading. And the kind of reading that they test is long-form passage-based reading, primarily nonfiction. So both the SAT and ACT will present students with passages on social science, natural science, and humanities. Both the SAT and ACT will present students with one passage which is drawn from a piece of prose fiction, sometimes modern, sometimes old, okay? The SAT also includes what is called a historical document passage drawn from a US founding document or part of the great global conversation on civil rights, human rights, women's rights, the role of a citizen, something like that. Okay. But basically, these exams are tests of student ability to quickly read and comprehend unfamiliar information, to understand what an author writes a passage to say. Now, both the SAT and ACT, primarily the SAT, were known for vocabulary questions. The SAT had the sentence completions in the last iteration. Before that, there were analogies, and people equate test prep with flashcards, with thousands of flashcards, that you're learning all kinds of esoteric words that ostensibly are important in college. Now, the SAT abandoned all of that advanced vocabulary after the test makers realized that if you give students tier 2 words, the more common but important academic words, they'll even get those wrong. So this is not to say that vocabulary isn't tested, although on the reading sections of these exams, it's vocabulary and context. The 21st century equivalent of a great college level vocabulary is a high level of graphicacy or graphical literacy. And the SAT tests that by adding graphs to the reading section. Now, the SAT went overboard. They also added graphs to the math section and even to the writing and language section. You'll find them throughout. ACT is different. There are no graphs on the ACT reading section, but instead, ACT has an entire section devoted to studying graphical literacy. That is the ACT science section. So you may have heard that the ACT has a science section. That's absolutely true. You may have heard that you need to know a lot of science to excel on the science section, and that is not true. The ACT science section is primarily a reading section, testing graphical literacy, scientific understanding, in scientific investigation, and understanding of models. There is a smattering of specific science knowledge that's tested, but really that's 0 to 3 questions per test. The SAT and ACT test grammar, which is to say that they test grammar in the context of multiple choice, covering the conventions of standard written English. ACT used to have a very nice way to describe the 2 different functional categories of writing that's tested. So mechanical skills, which encompasses sentence structure, punctuation, and usage in mechanics like noun-verb agreement, noun-pronoun agreement, adjectives, adverbs, the works. Also, rhetorical skills, basically the skills that a writer brings to bear to make sure that a piece of writing has excellent structure, has consistent style and tone, achieves or accomplishes a specific strategy. All of these skills are tested in multiple choice fashion on both exams. Now, the SAT writing and language section is almost identical to the ACT English. In fact, when College Board revised the SAT back in 2015, they basically copied the ACT English section, but they added a twist. They provided fewer questions with more time per question. So one of the big differences between SAT and ACT grammar is that you have more time per question on the SAT, on the grammar section. The difference is stark. On the ACT, you have 75 questions to answer in 45 minutes. On the SAT, you have 44 questions to answer in 35 minutes. So there's a sizable advantage, but otherwise the sections are almost the same. Now, the SAT and ACT both test math, and many people focus on the highest level of math that both exams test, which happens to be Algebra 2 Trig. Okay, so students that are in pre-calculus or calculus are already far removed from even the highest level of math. And that is just one piece of the holistic treatment of math on these exams, meaning that both tests very heavily emphasize geometry, or algebra, like basic algebra, and even arithmetic. So often students may know the most complex material, but they've forgotten basics like how to add fractions or what a prime number is. All right. So there's all kinds of statistics. The 2 exams have different emphases at the top level. Okay. So say, to score an 80th percentile or so on the SAT or ACT, it's basically the same math. But as you get into certain concepts, you see that ACT emphasizes more geometry, whereas the SAT emphasizes more specific topics in algebra 2 and graphing. Nonetheless, what the 2 agree on where they differ from math classes in school is that the 2 tests really emphasize problem solving and conceptual understanding. The tests feature lots of word problems. Students need to be able to find the twists, the shortcuts. They need to be creative and logical in their problem solving. Students who are competitive mathletes have a great advantage on the math section because they spend a lot of time thinking about how to solve difficult math problems conceptually. Some of the differences include the fact that on the ACT, students may use a calculator on every math question. And not just a four-function calculator. Students are able to use sophisticated graphing calculators. The SAT has a section where students may use a calculator. You certainly never have to. But there's also a section where students may not use a calculator to solve math problems. So you can tell that the SAT definitely emphasizes more math, mental math, and conceptual understanding, comfort. There are some students, you've met them, you may live with one, that needs a calculator to feel comfortable doing even basic math, and that's a disadvantage on the SAT. All right, and if you have questions, just start adding them up, put them in the chat, feel free. Now, the essay, this is a great topic to talk about because the SAT and ACT both include an optional essay. It's not part of the regular multiple choice. However, back a few weeks ago, College Board canceled their essay from, March is the last time students can take the writing sample. And I would be surprised. I know lots of students that were signed up to sit for the essay in March, and they shouldn't bother because there won't be an essay in May or June or ever again in the United States, at least until the tests change again. ACT has not canceled the essay, but there's no reason for anyone to take the essay. Going into 2021, there was maybe one school in the country, West Point, might have been the last holdout, asking for essay scores. But for a long time now, they have not been relevant in college admissions, and you can feel comfortable ignoring them. So we will. Let's talk about the scoring of the tests. Because the SAT and ACT are standardized tests. And in a sense, that means they're scored the same, but because they're different tests, they have different arbitrary scales. The way in which they're scored the same is simple. You get one raw score point for each question you get right. The ACT has long been a champion of what is called rights-only scoring, where there's no penalty for wrong answer. College Board used to feel that they didn't want students to be able to guess to a better answer. So there was a penalty for getting things wrong, but they recently eliminated that. And that means students should never leave a question unanswered on the SAT or ACT or PSAT, because the PSAT scored the same. Okay, never leave a question blank. Obviously, eliminating choices that you know are wrong will help you guess. But even if you guess randomly and you bubble in the proper bubble, you get the full point. Those are the raw scores. What's different is the arbitrary scale that is applied to each exam. I like to start with ACT because families that I speak to in the Northeast are more familiar with the SAT score. ACT is a little different, but really easy to understand. When you see a typical ACT score report, you're going to see certain important numbers and certain unimportant numbers. The numbers that are important are the scores for each of the 4 mandatory multiple choice sections and the composite. So the sections are English, math, reading, and science in that order on test day. And students will receive a 1 to 36 score. 1 is the worst, 36 is the highest. Those 4 section scores are averaged, rounding rules apply, for a composite. So here you see math, science, English, reading, writing, nobody cares. Science, STEM, which is an average in the math and science, nobody cares. ELA comes from the verbal side. And basically those section scores, those you'll see reporting category or sub-scores, and those are not used for college admissions. There are many states in the union that use the SAT and or ACT as state tests. So there's a lot of information that is produced in the score report that colleges do not look at, and they legitimately do not look at it. On the ACT score report, what matters is your 4 section scores and your composite score. The SAT report, it's a little more familiar in terms of the scale. The scale doesn't necessarily mean what it used to mean, which is to say, the SAT is scored on a 1600 scale. Students get 200 to 800 for the verbal section, which is now called evidence-based reading writing. Students get 200 to 800 for the math section. The evidence-based reading writing score comes half from the reading score. You get a 10 to 40 for reading. You get a 10 to 40 for writing and language. Those two sections are added up, multiplied by 10 for a 200, 800. Math is the combination of the raw scores for section 3, no calculator, section 4 calculator, and then scaled to a 200, 800. And then they're added together, nice and easy. Okay. You'll see other scores here. You will see cross-test scores. You will see sub-scores. Colleges don't look at any of that information. However, you do want to pay attention to percentiles. A percentile on the SAT or ACT tells you what percentage of students in a particular cohort, the graduating college-bound seniors for a given year, scored equal to or lower than your score. Okay. Now, the reason I bring this up is for two important reasons. First, we can use percentiles to compare SAT and ACT scores. As a matter of fact, College Board and ACT collaborated on a concordance table, which tells you exactly what ACT and SAT scores are equivalent. And that's basically pegged to percentile. Another reason is because when you look at the SAT score report, you see two different percentiles. In this case, we have a nationally representative percentile and an SAT user percentile. And when you look at the score, you wish that you can use the higher percentile, but in fact, you may not, because the nationally representative sample percentile on the SAT or PSAT score report is a meaningless number that compares your score to everyone who took the test and everyone who didn't take the test. Nobody cares about that score. It's meaningless. What they look at is the user percentile. So the SAT user percentile puts your score in the context of other students that took the test. In this case, a 1010, which in the old days would have been about 50th percentile, is now about 36th percentile. So when you're looking at contemporary SAT scores, look at the user percentile to understand, is this 50th percentile? Is it higher? Is it lower? I hope that makes sense to everybody. Let's talk about score policies. Like I said, colleges don't look at the sub-scores or the reporting categories. They don't look at cross-test scores. They look at full administrations or maybe section scores depending on their policy. Now, in the old days, most schools looked at every single test score. If a student took the SAT in May, June, and October, every one of those scores was on that student's transcript. That is not the case anymore. There are very few schools that want to see every score. Okay. If a school says they want to see every score, like say Yale usually wants to see every score, in which College Board will send all your scores, whether you like it or not. ACT still gives you the choice, but if a school asks for all your scores, you send all the scores. This is one reason why students should never take an official test until they're ready to test. Okay. But that said, most schools fall into a saner split of either score choice or super scoring when it comes to these test scores. And in fact, a lot of schools now are self-report. So you don't even get to this point until you've already been accepted. But score choice is important. Score choice means that you can take the SAT in May, June, and October. Say you get your best score in June. You send your June score and none other, and they don't even know you ever took the test again, nor do they care. And that's great. That means student can go into a test pretty comfortable that if the test goes poorly, no one will ever see it. If the test goes well, you've got it. Okay. Super scoring is even more generous, and it's a fantastic trend that is becoming more prevalent for both SAT and ACT. And a school that super scores, if they tell you that they super score SAT and you take the SAT in May and June and you get your best evidence-based reading, writing in May and your best math in June, you can send both of those test scores and the applications committee will put together your best evidence-based reading, writing, and math for a higher SAT score than you earned on either day and consider it without bias. For a school that super scores, they don't give extra weight to a natural 1500. If you get a super score of 1500, that's a 1500 to them. The schools that super score ACT will go by section: English, math, reading, science. You could take the test 4 times, send in the best section of each one. As a matter of fact, ACT is working. They planned in 2020 to roll out digital retesting, where you could take the test, you could take the ACT on a computer, and you could take just the sections that you wanted to. Now, like so many of us, their plans for 2020 were scuttled by certain unavoidable situations, but that's still something that ACT wants to get to. And one of the big features that ACT should be rolling out this year, if they're able, is that the score report will have a super score on it. So they'll actually do the math for you, let you know if your super score is better than a specific test administration. How do you find out what a school's policy is? There is no rule. There is no requirement that any school look at test scores any way except the way they want, which is to say, every school makes its own determination, and sometimes those determinations change by the month rather than the year. So the best way to find out how a school looks at the SAT or ACT is to consult some trusted sources of information. And that might be Naviance, if your school gives you access to Naviance. It might be the College Board Big Futures website. It might be a college's website, or it might be you, or even better, your teen calling the college directly. What's your current SAT or ACT score policy? Do you super score, score choice? Please tell me, thank you. And it's really good to call a school as long as you behave responsibly and maturely, because they keep track of all the contacts. Moving right along, let's talk about test optional. All right. I don't think anybody has made it to this point in the admissions process without at least hearing the term test optional. What does test optional mean? Does it mean that you don't have to take the SAT or ACT? So I want to be clear first about the terminology, because test optional is actually a technical term. And it means that students may, for schools that have test optional admissions, students may choose to submit test scores or not. This is different from test blind, which means that a school will not look at test scores even if you send them. There's 1, maybe 2 test blind schools in the country. So it's not common. But if you're applying to a test blind school, don't bother sending scores. They're not going to be secretly influential. All right. There are other schools that are test flexible, and test flexible means they want to see standardized tests, but they don't necessarily have to see the SAT or ACT. Maybe you can send them the CLT, a classic learning test. Maybe you could send AP scores. You used to, for test flexible schools, be able to send SAT subject tests. However, at the same time that College Board eliminated the SAT essay, they also canceled all future subject tests in the United States. So US students can't even take subject tests anymore, nor can you send them. But congratulations, that frees up May or June when you might have taken the subject tests this year, and that gives you more time to either focus on APs or take the SAT. Now, test optional admissions has always been around. They didn't necessarily call it test optional, but basically certain groups at any school had the option of applying, and they had lower requirements. All right. Think about a legacy. Okay. The 3rd or 4th generation of a family applying to a certain school usually gets favorable admissions treatment, regardless of scores. Okay. Full pay families often get preferential treatment, at least at some schools. Recruits, particular athletes that are being pursued. It's very common, if you've gone through the process or are currently going through the process, where coaches are actively seeking out your son or daughter for their team, they'll often give you a number. They'll say, most students need a 33 to get in this school, but if you can give me a 31, if you can give me a 29, I can get you in the school. All right. In a sense, that's not entirely test optional, but it means lower requirements. Okay. Traditionally underrepresented groups. Okay. Every college wants to represent a diversity of backgrounds, of views, of geography, right? So coming from different countries, coming from different states. If a student is applying to, say, Yale, right? Yale draw a lot of students from Connecticut and from New England, but the student who's applying from Montana has a little bit of an advantage because not a lot of students from Montana may apply there. All right. Finally, and this is relevant, those students who are superior students academically, meaning they have 3.9 GPAs or higher and already show academic rigor in their classes. They have fantastic extracurriculars, outstanding essays, great recommendations, all of that, and find that the test is the weak link in their application for a school that is avowed test optional. They may benefit from not sending in a test score. Everyone else still benefits because even even test optional schools, even famously test optional schools, take lots of students with test scores, and those test scores are very high. All right. University of Chicago is an ultra selective school. It is one of the hardest schools in the country to get into. It is also the most famously test optional of that elite level. However, more than half of students who apply to the school submit SATs. More than half submit ACTs. In fact, fewer than 20% of students are accepted by University of Chicago without test scores at all. And among the students who submit test scores, you can tell by the mid 50, which represents the 25th to 75th percentile range of scores from the incoming class. Those scores are very high, right? University of Rochester, right here in my backyard, famously test optional. Most students submit scores and it's hard to get into, right? So keep in mind that even test optional schools, even during this period of time where schools are still trying to figure out admissions priorities, test optional is a policy that often benefits a school more than it benefits a student. And I don't mean to be cynical about this, but test optional admissions can double the applicants to a school without doubling the number of seats they have available, which means that we are seeing in this particular cycle, we are seeing some schools where if they accepted 1 in 10 students, now they're accepting 1 in 5, 1 in 20 students. It becomes much harder to get into one of these schools. At the end of the day, test scores are still an important data point for many students, particularly those seeking acceptance at selective or highly selective schools. Now, PSAT scores, they matter in certain ways and they don't matter in certain ways. Okay. So, one thing to note is that the PSAT is more like the SAT that it ever has been. Okay. Traditionally, the PSAT has been a little different and it's been scored differently. And we've done all kinds of weird math to try to find an equivalent SAT to PSAT score. It's easy now because the PSAT and SAT are scored on the same exact scale, in that you can plug in the number of questions right on a PSAT to a standard SAT scale and approximate. But the PSAT, of course, has its own scale. And where it differs is that there are not as many questions on the PSAT as there are on the SAT. In fact, even if you get every question right on the PSAT, you cannot score a 1600. There are not enough points on the SAT scale. So the highest maximum score on each section of the PSAT is 760. The highest composite is 1520. So if a student comes up with a 1520, don't get upset. That means perfect. All right. Now, you should know a perfect score on the PSAT doesn't mean a thing to a college. They don't care. They don't look at the PSAT. What they will do with PSAT scores is purchase lists. And a student who scores high, the higher you score, the more colleges you hear from. But the real value in the PSAT comes for juniors, okay? So the PSAT is administered in normal years in October of junior year. There are 3 dates, 2 weekday dates, 1 weekend date, and each school picks one. And juniors who take the PSAT are automatically in the National Merit Scholarship process. They're in that's a qualifying test. And if a student scores high enough, and that's really high, then they may be considered for some level of recognition as they enter this National Merit Scholarship process. So this is based on a selection index. It's based each section of the test, the reading, the writing and language, and the math are evenly weighted, and students that score in the 98th or 99th percentile, depending on state, because the selection index changes state to state, and if you're in a competitive state, you need a much higher score. Again, those people in Montana are benefiting, where those of us in the Northeast are not. And then if a student qualifies, they still have other steps to take as they go from semifinalist to finalist to maybe a financial award. However, any level of National Merit Scholarship recognition is a great honor, and it looks good on a college application. Also, National Merit Scholarship, just the PSAT testing process is valuable to students who don't choose to test earlier than that. And I'll talk about why a lot of students do. Does everything I said about the SAT, ACT, and PSAT make sense so far? Still have more to talk about. I just want to make sure that these details made sense.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep going. But
yeah, we have a lot of questions, Mike, but so far it's very good. Thank you for explaining it so clearly.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to keep going, and there will be time to answer questions. How do you choose? So basically, I told you about two different tests. They sounded very similar, but you might have noticed some of the differences. The ACT is definitely more of a reading test. All right. Only 25% of the test is based on math. The rest is based on English passages, reading passages, and science passages. So there's a lot of reading that's going on, and there's a lot of reading at a fast pace. Okay. There's science reasoning, there's graphical literacy, there's an ability to pick out facts in a passage, not to memorize the facts, but to find them quickly. That's the kind of test the ACT is. As far as math goes, while ACT math can often resemble SAT math, there's an emphasis on more topics, more breadth, maybe not as much depth. The SAT, on the other hand, is a math forward exam. Okay, 50% of the test is the score is based on math, and that's math both with and without a calculator. That's math that really does focus on problem solving, critical reasoning, and a lot of creativity. Okay, the reading on the tests, you get a bit more time per reading question, you get significantly more time per grammar question. But the reading sections are sometimes considered tougher. You're more likely to encounter writing from the 18th or 19th century, which can be really challenging for students. All right. Now, that just looking at that is the easy way to tell which a student may be better on. You think of your student, you say, oh, my student is really great at math, but hates to read. Well, maybe the SAT is better for that student. My student is a great reader. She's a hard worker. Maybe she likes the ACT better. The more accurate way to determine is have your son or daughter take at least one of these in practice, if not both. Now, that's in practice. Do not, please, sign your son or daughter up for an official exam just to find out how they would do on the test. That's like signing your son or daughter up for the road test before you do driver's ed, just to see how much practice you need to do. We don't want to do that. You certainly don't want an official score on the record before you've prepared, because in some cases, major score increases from one test to another can be a red flag. I'm not saying if a student gets an official score, he or she shouldn't try to raise it as much as possible, but you don't want to draw undue attention. So you always take tests when you're ready for them. But for diagnostic purposes, take an SAT, take an ACT, Chariot Learning. We run proctored practice tests online every weekend. And take one of those tests and find out how you do. And you can use that information to make a decision. Keep in mind, students don't need to commit to one of the two tests before they start preparing. Quite often, we run SAT, ACT combo classes, or we work with students on both. And through the process of prepping, we figure out which test is better for them. Now, why do the SAT and ACT matter? It's simple. The SAT and ACT are not tests of virtue. They are not tests of intelligence. They are college entrance exams. They matter for college. They matter for college admissions. The higher your score, the more selective schools and programs you will be open to. They matter for college scholarship. Most merit scholarships are based on a matrix of grades and test scores. In some states, it's very clear. You get a certain test score, you get a certain scholarship. And what's great about these scholarships, merit aid, merit scholarship money, you don't have to pay back. That's the best kind, okay? College readiness is a really important part of this process, that even if a school was applying to a test optional school, I would still say take the SAT or ACT anyway. I just published an article this week for the National Test Prep Association about how can you tell if you're ready to go to college? Well, both the SAT and ACT establish specific readiness benchmarks, and these are research supported that will tell you the likelihood that you earn a certain score, and that gives you a 75% chance or better of earning a C, a 50% chance or better of earning a B on a specific entry-level college course. And if a student can't meet that standard, you have to be very worried about that student's chance of thriving in college. So college readiness is kind of like a road test. The SAT and ACT let you know if you will be safe to operate in a higher education environment. They also matter for NCAA eligibility if you want to play as a freshman in Division I sports. So let's talk about planning, because that is a major piece of the puzzle here, okay? So some of you may be parents of ninth graders or 10th graders. Some of you may be parents of 11th graders. If you're parents of 12th graders, I can only hope to wish you luck, because at this point you should be hearing back from colleges. 11th graders still have time to take the test. 10th graders, they're looking at a phenomenal opportunity to plan their entire year, all right? So my philosophy, and this is based on 27 years of working with countless students and educators in this process, is that students should strive to take the SAT and or ACT as early in junior year as makes sense based on their goals and their timeline. Goals means what kind of score do they want to earn? If your goal is to earn a really, really high score, but you haven't done Algebra 2 yet, you're obviously putting yourself at a lower chance, because there will be Algebra 2 on the test. But that is really the only material that's tested on that's taught on the normal track of 11th grade. There's no grammar that's being taught at the high school level at most schools. You're not learning to read any better for the SAT or ACT. So as long as a student has that Algebra 2 under his or her belt, or at least some of it, there's a chance to test well, okay? If a student is, in pre-calculus or calculus, they're already far from the math that's being tested, and you want to feel impatient to tackle this test before you forget any more math. So if we look at a school year as beginning when the last one ended, then the academic year really begins in July. And there is an ACT in like the second weekend of July, and that is available in most states. I have asterisks because it's not in normal years available in New York State, but everywhere else you can take it. Okay, there's an August SAT, and it's a really popular test. It's the last weekend of August, really popular for rising seniors and rising juniors. There's an ACT in September, okay? Really good, especially for students that were prepping for the August SAT. Now, here is a really strong recommendation. If your son or daughter is entering 11th grade and you think that there's National Merit Scholarship potential there, you should absolutely take the opportunity to prep over the summer, sit for the August SAT, sit for the September ACT if it's right. Every year we see students going into the PSAT already knowing that they finished. They got their ACT scores or the SAT scores back. They got the score they wanted, and the PSAT is it. They'll take the PSAT, then they'll be done. All right. But that doesn't happen for everybody, obviously. And you have October SAT, which for 12th graders, the October SAT in the first weekend of October is usually the last test that can be used for early action, early admission applications. Then you have an October ACT towards the end, and it's rare that those scores come back in time, so don't count on it for early action, early admission. Students that are not applying early action or early admission can take the November test. They could take the December SAT and ACT. That's the SAT first weekend. Second weekend is December. December is also when PSAT scores come back. So I don't recommend for students who are balancing a lot during junior year, especially those kinds of students that have winter and spring activities and AP exams, to wait until after the PSAT scores come back to make a plan for when they're going to take the test, because they've already lost half the year. Instead, what I recommend is look at your son or daughter's schedule. Look at the activities and the other commitments they'll engage in. Okay. If a student is in robotics, that is a priority. If a student is a wrestler, he can't test while he's keeping weight. If a student is taking AP exams, he or she cannot credibly sit for the May SAT, because there is a lot of subject review that goes into preparing for those May APs. So you look at the arc of the year, you realize that students can test well into 12th grade, but if you've earned your best scores by the end of 11th grade, you can feel great confidence. And by the time you get to spring break, you can start looking at schools and not worry about falling in love with a school that you're not going to qualify for. So think very much about planning. Now, another question people ask is, how long should prep take? And I liken prep to a season, just like a sports season, right? Every coach would love to have athletes for 12 months a year, but they can't. Okay. People can't maintain the competitive edge for that long. So instead, a truly competitive prep program should encompass 2 to 3 months of focused prep to reach a peak for a particular date. Obviously, planning so that you can hit a date, but then you know what the next one, your next chance to take the test quickly is beneficial. Students right now that are planning for the April ACT know that they'll be able to take the test again in June. Students who will take the March SAT will have May or June at their disposal. So it's nice to know what your plan B is, but it's also nice to really focus on preparing when you're not juggling a lot of academic or extracurricular commitments. Grades are still the first and most important factor for most students' college admissions. You never want to let your grades slip, but you want to think about when can you prep, keep your grades up, and not worry about a lot of other activities. Okay? And I talk about prep as if it's obvious that people are going to prep, because it's obvious that people are going to prep. The SAT and ACT embroil students in what is likely to be the greatest competition of their life. Okay, in that in a given year, a cohort encompasses roughly 2 million graduating college-bound seniors. Okay, that is a lot of students that you're competing against for a 99th percentile score. And the closer you get to the top, the more strenuously other people are preparing. They may be just as qualified, but they may be working harder. They may be working with better coaching. They may be more dedicated. Preparing for the SAT and ACT is a lot more like a sport or a skill than it is just a grade in school, right? For most tests in school, if you know the knowledge, you get the point, whether someone else gets it or not. And teachers test you in a way where they can just assess that you've learned what's been taught. But that's different than, say, baseball, right? Okay, two teams play, and no matter how good those teams are, one of those teams will have to win. And only one team can win the World Series, no matter how good other teams are. There are a finite number of test scores at each score point that are allocated, because the SAT and ACT are scored on a curve and students are distributed. So as you get closer to perfect, there are fewer and fewer scores to go around. That means it's a competition. And when you're competing, you prepare. All right. There's a lot more that I could talk about. I could talk about, you know, all the different kinds of prep out there, from online programs, Khan Academy. There are great books out there. There are classes, there are tutoring. You want to align prep with what works best for your son or daughter, what their learning styles are like, what meets your schedule, but also, try to get the best coaching that you can get for a shorter period of time. Look out for somebody that wants you to prep for a year. It's really hard to maintain focus on a year. And our experience, by the time you get a few months in, people start forgetting what they started with. Also, keep in mind that no matter how great your program is, a teen has to put in the work.